There is a photograph that should never have been developed, not because of what it shows, but because of what it proves. It was taken on the morning of October 17th, 1952, inside a room that, according to every official record in the National Archives, never existed. The negative sat undeveloped for 63 years inside a military footlocker buried beneath 4 inches of concrete in a decommissioned storage facility in Langley, Virginia. When the concrete was finally broken apart during a 2015 renovation, the footlocker had no markings, no serial number, no classification stamp, just a wax seal and a single handwritten note, folded and tucked beneath the negative, that read, "Do not let this be the last thing you see." The man who broke the concrete that morning was a contractor named Dale Huffman. He was 52 years old, a former Army Corps of Engineers veteran, a grandfather of 3, a man who had spent 30 years opening walls and floors and ceilings for a living without once finding anything that kept him awake at night. He handed the footlocker to his supervisor without opening it. His supervisor handed it to a facilities coordinator at the CIA. The facilities coordinator, a woman named Margaret Osei, opened it at 4:47 in the afternoon. She resigned the following morning. She has not spoken publicly since. But a former colleague who was present in the hallway outside her office that evening described the sound that came from behind the closed door as something between crying and praying, and said it went on for nearly an hour. No one knows exactly what Margaret Osei saw when she first looked at the photograph. What we know is what happened next. The negative was quietly transferred to a small, unnamed unit within the Defense Intelligence Agency. The renovation project was quietly completed. Dale Huffman was asked politely never to speak about what he found. He agreed. He moved to rural Montana the following spring and has lived there since, reportedly without a television, without internet, and without any photographs hanging on his walls. The story might have ended there. It did not, because one person inside that unnamed DIA unit made a copy. Her name was Carla Voss. She was 31 years old, a photographic analyst with a background in forensic imaging and a top-secret clearance she had held since the age of 26. She had spent her career examining surveillance photographs, satellite imagery, film recovered from crash sites. She was not easily disturbed. She had analyzed crime scene photographs. She had reviewed footage from places no civilian would ever be allowed to see. She looked at the developed print of that photograph for approximately 40 minutes before she made the copy. She later described those 40 minutes in a recorded statement, made in private, that was smuggled out of the DIA in pieces and eventually assembled by a network of independent researchers into a single, coherent document. "I kept thinking I was misreading it," she said in that statement. "I kept telling myself that what I was seeing was a trick of the light, a double exposure, a deterioration of the emulsion. I have been doing this for 9 years. I know what a deteriorated negative looks like. I know what double exposure looks like. I know what a trick of the light looks like. This was none of those things." She paused for a long time before continuing. "What I was looking at was a room full of people. Generals, men in suits, men I recognized from history books, and in the center of that room, caught in the flash of a press camera at 10:17 in the morning, was something that had no business existing on this planet." Carla Voss made her copy on a Tuesday. She disappeared on a Thursday. Her apartment in Falls Church, Virginia, was found clean, orderly, and empty. Her car was in the parking garage. Her purse was on the kitchen counter. Her phone was on the charger. She had been in the middle of eating dinner. The plate was still on the table, fork resting beside it, as if she had simply stepped away for a moment and never come back. The copy she made was found 6 months later in a safety deposit box in a bank in Richmond, Virginia, registered under a name that did not belong to her. The key had been mailed anonymously to a journalism professor at Georgetown University named Dr. Arthur Weil. Dr. Weil opened the box. He retrieved the photograph. He brought it to 3 separate institutions for analysis: the Smithsonian's Photographic Archives, a private forensic lab in Baltimore, and a retired Kodak chemical engineer in Rochester, New York, who had spent 40 years analyzing historical photographic prints. All 3 reached the same conclusion. The photograph was genuine. The emulsion was consistent with Kodak Plus X pan film from 1951 to 1953. The chemical degradation pattern was consistent with 60-plus years of storage. The grain structure was consistent with a speed graphic press camera, the standard tool of photojournalists in that era. There was no evidence of manipulation, retouching, or composite construction. The photograph was real, and what it showed should not have been possible. The room was large, formal, high-ceilinged, identifiable to Dr. Weil, who had studied Cold War-era Washington architecture, as the main conference room of the old executive office building. The assembled figures were visible in varying degrees of clarity depending on their distance from the flash. Men in military dress uniforms, men in dark suits, a cluster of figures near the back whose faces were partially obscured by shadow and motion blur. Near the right edge of the frame, barely visible but unmistakably present, stood a man Dr. Weil identified, after 3 weeks of comparative analysis with period photographs, as Vice President Alben Barkley. In the center of the room stood something that was not a man. The figure was tall. Carla Voss had estimated 6.5 feet, possibly more in her recorded statement, an estimate Dr. Weil's analysis confirmed based on comparative proportion with the surrounding figures and the known dimensions of the room. The limbs were elongated in a way that violated basic human skeletal geometry. The head was large, smooth, and shaped in a way that the human eye registered as deeply, viscerally wrong. The wrongness of something almost familiar, almost recognizable, but ultimately alien to every visual template the brain possessed. The skin, insofar as the black and white emulsion could convey such a thing, appeared to have texture, not smooth, not scaled, something in between, something that caught the flashlight in a way that human skin did not. The eyes. And this was the detail that Carla Voss had returned to again and again in her 40 minutes of analysis, the detail she had described in her recorded statement with a particular and unmistakable tremor in her voice. The eyes were large and dark, and reflected the camera flash in a way that created 2 small, cold, perfect circles of light in the center of each one. Like mirrors, like something looking back. Dr. Weil brought the photograph to a 4th expert in the autumn of 2016. This was Dr. Patricia Navarro, a professor of xenobiology and astrobiology at Johns Hopkins University, who had spent 20 years writing papers on the theoretical physiological characteristics of non-terrestrial life forms. She was not a person who frightened her easily. She had built her career on the assumption that the universe was vast and full of things humanity had not yet encountered. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she said something that Dr. Weil recorded in his notes, verbatim. "The proportions are consistent," she said, "not with any known species on Earth, but consistent with a theoretical biological architecture designed for a different gravitational environment. The limb ratio, the cranial volume relative to body size, even the eye placement, which suggests a visual field nearly twice what humans have. Whoever designed this body, whatever process produced this body, did not design it for this planet. She handed the photograph back. "Where did you say this was taken?" The answer, of course, was Washington, D.C., October 17th, 1952. The same day that, according to recently declassified and then quickly reclassified Project Blue Book documents, 3 press photographers who had been granted unusual access to the old executive office building were found dead in their hotel rooms within a 12-hour window. The cause of death listed in each case was cardiac arrest. 2 of the men were in their 30s. One was 28 years old. Their cameras were never recovered. Their film was never recovered. The access credentials that had allowed them into the building that morning were retroactively removed from all visitor logs, a fact discovered by a Freedom of Information Act researcher in 2009, who noticed the sequential numbering of credential stamps in the surviving log books jumped from 112 to 106 on that date. 4 credentials erased, 3 photographers, 3 missing cameras, 4 missing credentials. Someone else had been in that building with a camera, someone whose credential was also erased, but who, unlike the 3 photographers, had survived, and who had, before vanishing from the historical record entirely, managed to take one photograph that captured something the American government had spent 73 years pretending had never happened. Dr. Weil spent the following 18 months trying to identify the 4th photographer. He worked methodically, carefully, the way a man with a doctorate in historical research works, through archives, through union records of the press photographers' guilds of the era, through oral histories, through the personal papers of journalists who had covered the Truman administration. He was looking for a name, a face, a career that ended abruptly in the autumn of 1952. He found a ghost. The name, buried in a single paragraph in the unpublished memoir of a now-deceased Washington Post editor, was Thomas Greer. Freelance, 34 years old in 1952, no permanent address on record, no Social Security filing after October 1952, no death certificate, no marriage record, no family that anyone who had known him could identify. He existed in photographs, taken between 1948 and 1952, always in the background of press events, always with a camera, always slightly out of focus, as if even the photographic record was trying to erase him. And then, in November of 1952, he stopped existing. No obituary, no missing persons report, no forwarding address, no final byline, nothing. Except one thing, in the personal effects of a retired military archivist who died in 2003. His family found a small wooden box containing, among other items, a handwritten note on a torn piece of paper. The archivist had served at Fort Meade from 1951 to 1967. His family had no idea what the note meant, and had kept it only because it was inside a box that also contained his medals. The note read, "TG was processed out at 0300, nothing left to find. T.G. Thomas Greer. Processed out, a phrase that, in the military lexicon of the 1950s, had 2 meanings. One, administrative, one that was never written in official documents, but was understood by everyone who had worked in the black facilities, the unnamed units, the projects that existed in the spaces between the declassified record. Dr. Weil sat with that note for a long time. He understood in a way that was cold and absolute, and without any remaining room for doubt, that Thomas Greer had not disappeared. He had been disappeared. He had been in that room on October 17th, 1952. He had taken the photograph. He had done what any journalist of courage and instinct would do. He had hidden the negative, sealed it, buried it somewhere he believed it would survive. He had been right. It had survived 63 years, but Thomas Greer had not survived 63 days. Dr. Weil published none of this. Not yet. He was a careful man, a methodical man, a man who understood that what he had was extraordinary, and that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence presented in the right way at the right time. He continued his research. He continued his analysis. He made additional copies of the photograph and stored them in separate locations, telling only his most trusted colleague, a former student named James Park, where they were. He was 2 months away from completing a manuscript when his university office was broken into. Nothing was taken. His computer was untouched. His files were undisturbed, except for one folder, a single manila folder labeled, in Dr. Weil's own handwriting, Kyle Vore, Primary Documentation. Empty. The name Kyle Vore appeared nowhere in any public document. Dr. Weil had found it in a single source, a single fragmented page from what appeared to be a Project Majestic internal communication, the kind of document that leaked out of government archives in pieces, in photocopies of photocopies, in ways that could never be fully authenticated but could never be fully dismissed. On that page, in the dry bureaucratic language of Cold War intelligence, was a designation. The entity referred to in public-facing documentation as the visitor had been assigned the identifier Kyle Vore for all internal communications, effective October 18th, 1952, 1 day after the photograph was taken. 1 day after it arrived. Whoever had broken into Dr. Weil's office had not been looking for the photograph. They had known about the photograph. They had been looking for something else. They had been looking to find out how much he knew about the name. James Park called Dr. Weil the night of the break-in. They spoke for 47 minutes. Dr. Weil was measured, calm, the way a man is calm when fear has moved past panic into something deeper and colder. He told James Park where the remaining copies of the photograph were stored. He described in detail the chain of custody. Dale Huffman, Margaret Osei, Carla Voss, the safety deposit box, the key, the bank in Richmond. He told James Park that the thing in the photograph was not the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part, he said, was something that had taken him 14 months to notice. Something so subtle, so small, that even a trained photographic analyst like Carla Voss had apparently not caught it, or if she had caught it, had not recorded it in her statement. In the far left corner of the photograph, partially obscured by the edge of the frame and the dark shape of a uniformed general's shoulder, there was a figure. Not the central figure, not the thing that every eye was drawn to immediately. A smaller figure, standing near the wall, dressed in a dark suit, face turned not toward the center of the room, not toward the creature that had stopped every other person in that room in their tracks, turned toward the camera, toward Thomas Greer, looking directly at the lens. The face was blurred by distance and the imprecision of a speed graphic at the edge of its focal range. But Dr. Weil had spent 4 months enhancing, analyzing, and comparing that face against every photographic record of Truman administration officials he could access. It did not match any of them. The face in the corner was not a general, not a politician, not a scientist or a bureaucrat. The proportions were subtly, quietly, unmistakably wrong in exactly the same ways the central figure's proportions were wrong, just less obvious, just human enough to stand in a room full of humans and not immediately alarm them, just human enough that, if you were not looking, if you were not specifically analyzing the spatial geometry of the face for inconsistencies at the pixel level you would never notice. Dr. Wilde told James Park what this meant. It had not come alone. One had come to be photographed, to be presented, to be official, to stand in the center of the room and allow itself to be seen, to answer questions through a mechanical translator with a voice like cold metal, to tell the assembled power of the United States government that 8 civilizations had been corrected before, that the cycle final had begun. The other one had come to watch the watchers, to stand in the corner of the room and observe who was afraid, who was not afraid, who was paying attention, who was recording, who might become a problem. Thomas Greer had been a problem. Dr. Wilde said this very quietly. Then he said, "James, I need you to listen carefully. I want you to take the copies, and I want you to scatter them somewhere I don't know. I'm telling you this because if I don't know where they are, I can't tell anyone where they are, regardless of the circumstances." James Park asked what he meant by regardless of the circumstances. Dr. Wilde was quiet for a moment. "It stood in that room for 6 hours," he said. "It answered questions. It cooperated, it performed, and the whole time, its partner stood in the corner and made a list. Not a written list, not a list anyone could confiscate or destroy. Do you understand what I mean?" He didn't wait for an answer. Wherever Kyle Vore went after October 17th, 1952, whatever facility in Nevada, whatever black site, whatever story they told themselves about having it contained and controlled, the other one walked out of that building on its own, in its suit, with its list, and it has had 70 years to do with that list, whatever it intended. There was a long silence on the call. 70 years, Dr. Wilde said again, softer this time. That's a long time to be patient. That's a long time to prepare. The call ended at 11:23 p.m. At 6:15 the following morning, Arthur Wilde did not arrive for his 8 a.m. class. His office was locked. His apartment was found by James Park, who drove there in a panic at noon, in a condition that defied easy description. Not ransacked, not disturbed, not the evidence of a struggle or a flight, or any of the things a mind conditioned by crime dramas would expect. Clean, orderly, exactly as it should be. Except for one thing, every photograph in the apartment. And Arthur Wilde had been a man who kept photographs, who kept pictures of his family and his students and his travels framed on every available surface, had been turned to face the wall. Every single one. James Park retrieved the copies of the photograph as instructed. He has moved 7 times in the past 4 years. He communicates only through encrypted channels with a small group of researchers who have spent those same 4 years attempting to trace the historical record of what walked out of the old executive office building on the evening of October 17, 1952. They have found evidence of it everywhere, in the gaps, in the files that should exist but don't, in the careers that ended without explanation, in the rooms where decisions were made that no one could afterward explain, in the policies that seemed, to anyone willing to look closely enough, less like human choices and more like preparations, less like governance and more like management, less like a civilization charting its own course, and more like something being carefully, methodically, patiently moved toward an outcome that was decided long before anyone in Washington was ever born. The photograph still exists. James Park still has it. He has never looked at the figure in the corner directly. He says he has always stopped himself just before bringing it fully into focus. He knows what Dr. Wilde told him. He understands what it means. But there is something else. something he has told only one person, in a message that was destroyed immediately after reading, in the lower right corner of the photograph, an area that no analyst, including Carla Voss, including Dr. Whale, had examined with any particular attention, because the lower right corner contained nothing but the edge of a table and a partial view of the floor. There is a shadow, not the shadow of any figure visible in the frame, a shadow that falls from a direction inconsistent with the position of the single overhead flash that produced all the other shadows in the photograph, a shadow that would require a third figure to cast it, a figure standing somewhere outside the frame, somewhere the camera could not see. James Park says he does not intend to look more closely. He says he has learned, from everything that has happened to everyone who looked more closely, that there are questions whose answers are not for us, that there are things that have been watching us for a very long time, that they are not afraid of being seen. They are only interested in seeing us first, somewhere tonight, in a location James Park has not disclosed to anyone alive. That photograph sits in darkness, undisturbed, its shadows falling in the wrong directions, its corners holding figures that were never meant to be found, still developing in some terrible and patient way into something none of us are ready to see.